The first thing Dan Holston saw when he pulled into his driveway was a stranger on his property. It was a man in a crisp, white polo shirt with an Oak Haven ACC volunteer logo embroidered over the heart. He stood on Dan's lawn, his private lot, with a tape measure in one hand and a clipboard in the other, scrutinizing the old tool shed that stood near the back fence. The man was measuring the distance from the shed to the property line, his lips moving silently as he jotted down numbers. Dan killed the engine of his truck, the silence that followed feeling heavier than it should. 6 months. 6 grueling months in Alabama, sleeping on a hospital pull-out couch while his younger brother, Mark, learned to walk again after a catastrophic spinal surgery. All Dan had wanted was the quiet hum of his own refrigerator, the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth, and the solid peace of his grandfather's house. Instead, he got this. He swung himself out of the cab, his joints protesting the 12-hour drive. "Can I help you?" The man looked up, startled, but his smile was immediate and practiced. "Afternoon, Daniel Holston." "Right. Welcome back. I'm Bill with the Architectural Control Committee." He gestured with his clipboard toward the shed. "Just doing a routine community survey, making sure our records are up to date." The interaction was polite, but laced with a procedural menace that set Dan's teeth on edge. This wasn't a friendly, "How do you do?" This was an inspection. "On my private property?" Dan asked, keeping his voice level. "The CC&Rs grant the ACC right of entry for architectural review," Bill said, the phrase rolling off his tongue as if he'd recited it 100 times. "We're just standardizing our files on all outbuildings. No cause for concern." The shed wasn't an outbuilding. It was a glorified box that housed the pump for his grandfather's well. Dug decades before Oak Haven was a glimmer in a developer's eye. It was a symbol of the independence his grandfather had cherished, a value passed down to Dan like a family heirloom. "The shed has been there for 40 years. Dan said, "It's on the original property survey." "I'm sure it is," Bill said, his smile never wavering. "Like I said, just updating our records. You'll be hearing from the board if there are any discrepancies. Have a great day." Bill clipped his tape measure to his belt, gave a short, dismissive wave, and walked off Dan's lawn, as if he had every right to have been on it in the first place. Dan watched him go, a knot tightening in his gut. He looked around the cul-de-sac. The lawns were immaculately edged. The mailboxes were all a uniform matte black, and there wasn't a single decorative flag or garden gnome in sight. The neighborhood felt sterile, coiled, like a spring wound too tight. Something had changed while he was away. Something more than just the landscaping. Inside, the house smelled of old books and cedar, a scent that usually brought him comfort, but now felt like a memory of a time that was gone. He dropped his duffel bag by the door, the exhaustion of the past 6 months washing over him. He'd spent his life in the military, a master sergeant who understood rules and chains of command. But this felt different. This wasn't about order. It was about control. Later that evening, he called his brother. Mark's voice was stronger, clearer than it had been in months. "You made it back?" Mark asked. "Just walked in." "Place is still standing," Dan said, trying to sound more relaxed than he felt. "How's the physical therapy going?" "Brutal, but I took 5 steps without the walker today." A wave of relief washed over Dan. "That's incredible." "Mark, really?" "Yeah. Well, you can stop worrying about me for 5 minutes and enjoy being home," Mark said. "Go sit on your porch. Drink a beer. Do whatever it is old men do for fun." Dan chuckled, but the image of Bill with his tape measure flashed in his mind. "It's quiet here. Almost too quiet." He decided not to mention the ACC visit. Mark had enough to worry about. The next day, he saw his neighbor Gary Henderson struggling with a lawnmower. Gary was in his late 70s, one of the original homeowners, a man who had known Dan's grandfather. Dan walked over to help. "Good to have you back, son," Gary said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Place wasn't the same without you." "Good to be back. Gary, how have things been?" Gary's smile faded. He glanced around before leaning in closer. Different. Tense. "You heard about the new board president?" "Let me guess. Karen Duvall." Gary nodded grimly. "Got herself elected while half the neighborhood was on summer vacation. Turnout was low. She and her slate swept the board. Since then, it's been a flood of notices. Mailbox height, non-approved trash can lids, color of garden hoses, petty stuff. But it adds up. People are afraid to talk to each other, afraid they'll be reported for something." Dan thought of the sterile perfection of the street. It wasn't community pride. It was compliance born of fear. "She's trying to elevate the community standards," Gary said, making air quotes with his fingers. "What she's really doing is driving out anyone who doesn't fit her mold, or anyone who pushes back." Before he left, Gary handed Dan a thick, spiral-bound copy of the Oak Haven governing documents. "You might want to read these again," he said, his voice low. "She knows them by heart, uses them like a weapon." That night, Dan sat at his grandfather's old oak desk and opened the CC&Rs. He skimmed the familiar sections on lawn maintenance and dues until his eyes landed on a clause a previous owner had highlighted in yellow years ago. 8.4.2 View corridor integrity. No structure, fence, or significant landscaping element may be erected or maintained on any lot that materially obstructs the designated view corridors as defined on the community plat map, or as otherwise determined by the Architectural Control Committee in its sole discretion. He read it twice. It was boilerplate legalese, vague and subjective. In its sole discretion. That was the part that chilled him. He closed the book, the knot in his stomach returning. The peace he had craved felt a million miles away. He was home, but it didn't feel like his own anymore. It felt like he was on contested ground, and he had a sinking feeling the first shot was about to be fired. The letter arrived a week later, not in his mailbox, but via a certified mail slip, left stuck to his front door. Dan had to drive to the post office to sign for it, a formal, deliberate act that signaled the end of polite warnings. The envelope was thick and bore the official Oak Haven HOA letterhead. He sat in his truck in the post office parking lot and slid it open with his pocket knife. The language was cold, impersonal, and absolute. Formal notice of violation. Date: April 12, 2024. Property: 112 Arbor Lane, Lot 39. Owner: Daniel Holston. Dear Mr. Holston, this letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC&Rs of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association. An architectural review conducted on April 5, 2024 by the Architectural Control Committee ACC has identified a non-compliant structure on your property. The detached outbuilding, hereafter referred to as the shed located on the rear of your lot, is in violation of CC&R Figure 8.4.2 View Corridor Integrity. The aforementioned shed materially obstructs the designated view corridor from the adjacent common area, negatively impacting the aesthetic uniformity and value of the community. Corrective action required. You are required to permanently remove the non-compliant shed from your property. Compliance deadline. You have 14 days from the date of this notice to cure the violation. The deadline for compliance is April 26, 2024. Failure to comply by the specified deadline will result in the imposition of monetary fines, beginning at $100 and escalating weekly thereafter, as outlined in the association's official fine schedule. Continued non-compliance may lead to further legal action, including the placement of a lien on your property. You have the right to request a hearing before the Board of Directors to contest this violation. A hearing request must be submitted in writing to the board within 10 days. Sincerely, the Oak Haven HOA Board of Directors. Dan read the letter 3 times. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The courtesy notice had been Bill on his lawn. This was the official declaration of war. They weren't just asking him to move a structure. They were demanding he dismantle a piece of his family's history, the very housing for the well that represented his independence. The phrase view corridor was a smokescreen from the common area behind his house. The only thing his shed blocked the view of was his other neighbor's fence. His first instinct, the master sergeant's instinct, was to fight back with overwhelming force, to storm into the management office and demand answers. But he caught himself. That was Karen's game: emotional, reactive conflict. His training had taught him something else. Procedure is both a weapon and a shield. He needed to use their own rules against them. He went home and began to assemble his arsenal. He found his grandfather's original property file in the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside was the survey map from 1983, a year before the Oak Haven HOA was even incorporated. The map clearly showed the lot, the house, and a small square in the back marked well house. It was proof. The structure was grandfathered in. It predated the CC&Rs themselves. He spent the next hour composing a polite, factual email to the HOA board. He attached a high-resolution scan of the survey map. Subject: response to violation notice, Lot 39. Dear Board of Directors, I am in receipt of the formal violation notice dated April 12, 2024, regarding the shed on my property. I am writing to formally contest this violation and request its immediate dismissal. The structure in question is the housing for a private well that predates the establishment of the Oak Haven HOA. As you can see from the attached 1983 property survey, the well house was an existing structure at the time the CC&Rs were drafted and recorded. Under established principles of property law, pre-existing structures are typically grandfathered and not subject to subsequently enacted covenants. Furthermore, Farger 8.4.2 is untenably vague regarding what constitutes a designated view corridor. I request a copy of the official plat map referenced in the CC&Rs that explicitly delineates these corridors. I trust this documentation will resolve the matter. Please confirm in writing that the violation has been rescinded. Sincerely, Daniel Holston, 112 Arbor Lane. He hit send and leaned back, a small sense of victory settling in. He had provided clear, irrefutable evidence. He had followed their procedure. Any reasonable board would see the facts and drop the issue. But as the days ticked by with no response, a cold certainty grew in his mind. This wasn't about reason. It was about power. And Karen Duvall had no intention of ceding any of hers. The fight was just beginning. 2 weeks after the formal violation notice, another certified letter arrived. It was a notice of hearing. Dan was being summoned to appear before the HOA Board of Directors to plead his case. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse. Dan spent the weekend preparing as if it were a military briefing. He printed large, clear copies of his grandfather's property survey. He organized his documents in a binder with tabbed sections, correspondence, violation notices, property records. He even prepared a short, concise opening statement, focusing on facts, not emotion. He was confident. The law and history were on his side. The clubhouse meeting room was small and airless, dominated by a large mahogany table. Karen Duvall sat at the head, flanked by the two other board members, Philip Graham and Maria Flores. Philip was a nervous-looking man who avoided eye contact, while Maria stared at her notepad with unnerving intensity. A representative from the HOA's management company, a young woman named Jessica, sat in the corner, taking minutes. Karen called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a small gavel. She wore a tailored cream blazer, her posture ramrod straight. The next item on the agenda is the violation hearing for Lot 39, owner Daniel Holston. Mr. Holston, you have 10 minutes to present your case. Dan stood and walked to the small lectern facing the board. He calmly laid out his evidence. Good evening. I'm here to address the violation notice regarding the shed on my property, as I stated in my email, to which I received no reply. The structure is not a simple shed. It is the housing for a private well that has been on the property since 1983. He placed the enlarged survey map on the table in front of them. This is the original county-filed survey. As you can see, the well house is documented here, a full year before the Oak Haven CC&Rs were recorded. It is a legally pre-existing, grandfathered structure. He paused, letting them look at the document. Philip Graham squinted at it, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Maria Flores didn't look up from her notes. Karen glanced at the map for less than a second before pushing it back toward him. Her smile was thin and polite. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Holston. The board appreciates your diligence in providing this historical document. She folded her hands on the table. However, the grandfathering of a structure does not grant it immunity from all covenants in perpetuity. Specifically, those pertaining to the ongoing health, safety, and aesthetic harmony of the community. The board's position is that Paragraph 8.4.2, regarding view corridors, applies to all structures, regardless of their age, if the ACC determines they negatively impact the community. Dan felt a surge of disbelief. The ACC's determination seems entirely subjective. What specific view is being blocked, and where is the official map that defines these corridors? As mentioned in the CC&Rs. The map provides a general framework, Karen said smoothly, but the clause also grants the ACC sole discretion to identify and enforce obstructions as they arise to maintain property values for everyone. The committee, after careful on-site review, determined the structure is non-compliant. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic deflection. She was using the vagueness of the rule as a weapon, twisting sole discretion into absolute power. So, to be clear, Dan said, his voice dangerously calm, the board is choosing to ignore documented, pre-existing property rights in favor of a subjective, discretionary interpretation of a vaguely written rule. The board is choosing to uniformly enforce the covenants our members agreed to upon purchasing their homes. Karen corrected him, her tone icy. Is there anything else? Dan knew he had lost. This wasn't a hearing. It was a formality, a box to be checked before the inevitable conviction. No, he said, gathering his papers. There's nothing else. He sat back down. Karen looked at her fellow board members. The board has reviewed the evidence and heard the homeowner's testimony, all in favor of upholding the violation and imposing the initial fine of $100. Karen's hand shot up, after a moment's hesitation. Maria's hand went up as well. Philip Graham looked at Dan, then at his hands, and finally, reluctantly, raised his own. The motion carries. 3-0, Karen announced, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. Mr. Holston, You will receive a formal notice of the board's decision and the initial fine. You have 14 days to pay the fine and remove the structure. Thank you for your time." She banged the gavel. And just like that, it was over. Dan walked out into the cool night air, the fluorescent lighting of the clubhouse still burning in his vision. He hadn't been outmaneuvered. He'd been railroaded. Logic and evidence didn't matter. His grandfather's survey map, his key piece of evidence, was worthless against a board that had already made its decision. He had come prepared for a legal argument, but this was a political battle. He had brought a rifle to a knife fight in a closet. He realized then that he couldn't win by arguing about his own small square of land. To fight Karen, he had to understand her larger game. Why this shed? Why now? The view corridor was a pretext. There had to be another reason, a hidden motive. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that he wouldn't find it in the HOA's neatly bound book of rules. He would have to dig deeper. The first fine notice arrived in the mail 2 days later. $100. It felt less like a penalty, and more like an insult. Dan filed it away in his binder and started his investigation. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone who understood the labyrinthine world of property records and bureaucratic red tape. He needed an expert. He found one in Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a retired county title clerk who had lived in Oak Haven for 30 years. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s, with a reputation for knowing where every metaphorical body in the county's public records was buried. Dan found her tending her prize-winning roses in her front yard. He explained the situation, laying out the violation, the hearing, and Karen's dismissal of his grandfathered-in claim. Eleanor listened patiently, snipping a dead rose head with a precise snick of her shears. When he finished, she looked up, her eyes bright and analytical. She ignored the survey map. Dismissed it as irrelevant. Dan confirmed. Eleanor let out a dry chuckle. Amateur. The survey is your land. The plat map is the whole neighborhood. They're not the same thing. She's banking on you not knowing the difference. She mentioned the plat map. Dan said, claimed it was a general framework. Hogwash, Eleanor said, dusting dirt from her gloves. The official plat map is a legal document filed with the county recorder. It defines every lot, every road, and, most importantly, every easement. It's not a framework. It's the blueprint. If these view corridors of hers aren't explicitly marked on that map as a scenic easement, then her claim is built on sand. She pointed a trowel at him. You need to stop fighting her on your turf. You need to get off your lot and look at the bigger picture. Go to the county recorder's office. Pull the official plat map for Oak Haven. Section 3. Don't ask for a copy. Ask to see the original Mylar. Look for any easements on or near the common area behind your property. Dan felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was a clear objective, a new line of attack. And what am I looking for? Exactly. You'll know it when you see it, Eleanor said with a cryptic smile. Bureaucracies run on paper. Dear, and Karen just created a paper trail. Now you need to follow it. As his investigation began, Dan started talking to his neighbors again, not just about the weather, but about their own struggles with the HOA. The stories poured out. Tom, a young father down the street, had been fined for his son's basketball hoop, which the board suddenly deemed an unapproved permanent structure. Maria, an artist, was cited because the decorative tiles on her porch were a shade of blue, not on the pre-approved color palette. It was a pattern of targeted, arbitrary enforcement designed to generate revenue and enforce compliance. He was gathering allies, people who were tired of living under Karen's thumb. His most important ally, however, remained his brother Mark. Their nightly calls were a lifeline. "It's like she's trying to provoke a reaction," Dan said one evening, pacing his kitchen. "She's escalating everything so fast." "Sounds like a classic bully tactic." Mark's voice crackled over the speakerphone. "They push until they find a boundary. Then they push harder. Don't let her get in your head. Stick to the plan. You're good at plans." Mark was right. Dan's military background had taught him to be methodical, patient, and thorough. He spent hours on the HOA's public website, a poorly designed portal where board meeting minutes were uploaded as PDFs. He started downloading them, going back 2 years. As he scrolled through the files from the past 6 months since Karen took over, he noticed something odd. In the budget sections, under line items for common area maintenance and landscaping projects, entire rows of vendor names and payment amounts were redacted, blacked out completely. He printed out a copy. Why would a board redact routine payments from public minutes? It was a tangible mystery. What were they hiding? Armed with Eleanor's advice and a growing sense of unease, Dan drove to the county recorder's office the next morning. The building smelled of old paper and dusty microfilm. After filling out a request form, a clerk returned with a long, heavy roll of mylar sheeting. It was the original plat map for Oak Haven. Dan carefully unrolled it on a large, backlit table. He saw the familiar grid of streets and lots, each line precise and unchangeable. He found his own property, Lot 39, and the small common area behind it. He traced the property lines with his finger, his eyes scanning for any notation. And then he saw it. It was a dotted line, faint but clear, running along the back of several properties, including Karen's. Labeled next to it were the letters P-U-E. Eleanor's words echoed in his head. Public utility easement. It wasn't a scenic easement. It wasn't a view corridor. It was a designated zone for municipal utilities. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was where the easement ran. It cut directly behind Karen Duvall's lot, a wide, 20-foot swath of land designated as a common area, but controlled by the easement. Suddenly, the redacted minutes clicked into place. The exorbitant common area landscaping projects Karen had been pushing through, they weren't for the whole neighborhood. They were likely focused on this specific strip of land. Why would Karen be so obsessed with clearing a view corridor that didn't legally exist, while simultaneously spending thousands of dollars on landscaping a utility easement behind her own house? It didn't make sense as an HOA issue, but it made perfect sense as a personal project disguised as community business. He took a photo of the plat map with his phone, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to connect, forming the outline of a picture he didn't fully understand yet. He had gone looking for a shield to defend his shed, and had found a sword instead. Karen's fixation wasn't just about control. It was about something else. Something she was hiding behind blacked-out lines in a budget report and a phantom view corridor. And, for the first time, Dan felt he had the upper hand. The second fine notice, for $200, arrived with impersonal precision. Dan ignored it. He was too busy digging. He sent the photo of the plat map to Eleanor, along with the redacted minutes. Her reply was swift. The PUE is interesting, but the redactions are the key. That's where the money is. I might know a guy who knows a guy. Let me make some calls. While Eleanor worked her back channels, Karen escalated. A third certified letter appeared, this one from the HOA's management company. The tone had shifted from procedural to predatory. Notice of intent to lien. It was the ultimate threat in the HOA arsenal. Unpaid fines, now totaling over $500 with late fees and administrative charges, had reached the threshold where the association could legally place a lien on his property. It was a direct threat to his ownership of his home. A ticking clock, designed to force him into submission. If the lien was perfected, they could eventually foreclose. The fight had become existential. Simultaneously, Karen opened a new front. Dan was outside trimming his hedges when he saw one of the ACC volunteers, a known loyalist of Karen's, taking photos of Gary Henderson's house. Later that day, Gary shuffled over to Dan's porch, a violation notice clutched in his trembling hand. "She got me. Dan," he said, his voice strained. "Said my garden shed is a violation of the setback rule. 45.1.3. That shed's been there longer than my kids have been alive. I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford these fines." Dan's blood ran cold. It was a calculated, cruel move. Karen knew Gary was his friend, one of the few original homeowners left. She was targeting the most vulnerable person he knew to send a message. Your resistance has consequences for others. That evening, Dan's phone rang. It was Karen. "Mr. Holston," she said, her voice dripping with false congeniality. "I was hoping we could find a more neighborly resolution to our little disagreement." "There's nothing neighborly about threatening an old man over a garden shed," Dan shot back. "Oh, dear. Was that today?" She feigned ignorance. "The ACC is so very thorough. You know, rules are rules. We must enforce them all equally." There was a pause. "However, the board does have discretion. Perhaps if the non-compliant structure on your lot were to be removed, the board could be convinced to show leniency regarding other minor infractions in the neighborhood, like Mr. Henderson's." There it was, the offer, the secondary moral dilemma laid bare. Drop his fight, and she would spare the innocent man she was using as a pawn. It was a gangster's bargain, dressed up in HOA politeness. "You're offering to selectively not enforce the rules in exchange for my compliance?" Dan asked, making sure his words were precise. "I'm offering a path to community harmony," she purred. "The choice is yours. I do hope you make the right one. The annual homeowners meeting is next week. It would be a wonderful opportunity to announce that this matter has been resolved." She hung up, leaving Dan in a state of quiet fury. She had overplayed her hand. She hadn't just confirmed her selective enforcement, she had tried to make him a co-conspirator. The moral choice was clear, but the path to victory was now more complicated. He had to find a way to expose Karen's corruption without bringing Gary down in the process. The next day, Eleanor called, her voice electric with discovery. "I got them," she said. "The unredacted invoices." "How?" "My friend at the management company owed me a favor from 20 years ago. He's disgusted with Karen's tactics. He pulled the originals before they were blacked out for the public record." She emailed him the files. Dan opened them, and the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The invoices were from a company called Evergreen Prestige Landscaping. Over the past 6 months, they had been paid over $50,000 for common area beautification and clearing. The address for Evergreen Prestige Landscaping was listed in the next county over. A quick search of state business records gave him the owner's name, Martin Duval, Karen's brother-in-law. She wasn't just clearing a phantom view corridor. She was using HOA funds, funneled through redacted budgets, to pay her own family exorbitant amounts of money to clear a public utility easement behind her house. The view corridor violation against his shed was a pretext to remove the one structure that partially obstructed the view of the land she was developing with community money for her own benefit. Rumors had been swirling about a new luxury condo development, planned for the land adjacent to the easement. A cleared sightline would make that property, and by extension, Karen's own, vastly more valuable. It was classic. Textbook corruption, selective enforcement, a manufactured crisis, and financial kickbacks, all hidden behind a wall of bureaucratic procedure. He now had the motive, the evidence, and the paper trail. The annual meeting was in 3 days. He finally had the ammunition he needed. The annual homeowners meeting was Karen Duvall's stage. It was held in the largest room of the clubhouse, and she ran it with the iron-fisted precision of a dictator. Homeowners were given a strict 3-minute time slot for public comments, a rule she enforced ruthlessly. A large digital timer was projected onto the screen behind the board's table, its red numbers a constant. Visible pressure. Dan arrived early and took a seat in the back. He watched as his neighbors filed in. Tom, Maria, Gary, and dozens of others who had been fined, harassed, or simply intimidated into silence. They nodded at him. A silent coalition of the fed up. Karen, seated at the center of the head table, looked serene and confident. She opened the meeting with a glowing report on the association's financial health and the success of her community standards initiative. She didn't know that Eleanor had already discreetly distributed a single-page summary of Dan's findings to a dozen key homeowners just before the meeting started. A quiet buzz was already building. When the time for homeowner comments arrived, Dan was the third person to the microphone. He placed his folder on the lectern as the timer on the screen behind Karen blinked to life. Thrafri, Wachachi. Good evening, he began, his voice calm and steady, projecting to the back of the room. My name is Dan Holston, Lot 39. I am here tonight to discuss the board's recent focus on Barber 8.4.2, the View Corridor Rule. Karen's smile tightened. She was expecting a personal grievance. She was not prepared for a public prosecution. For the past 6 weeks, my family has been threatened with fines and a lien on our home for a shed that has stood for 40 years. The board claims it violates a view corridor. I argued it was a grandfathered structure. He clicked a remote, and a picture of his grandfather's survey map appeared on the projector screen. 45. This is the 1983 survey, showing the shed's existence before the HOA was formed. The board dismissed it. He clicked again. A high-resolution image of the official county plat map replaced the survey. 2:30. This is the official plat map. As you can see, there is no view corridor or scenic easement recorded anywhere behind my property. There is, however, a public utility easement running along the back of several lots, including the one belonging to our board president. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's composure began to crack. She gripped the edge of the table. Which brings me to the HOA's finances, Dan continued, his voice even. He clicked the remote. 2 documents appeared side by side on the screen. On the left, a page from the public board minutes, with thick black bars redacting the landscaping budget. On the right, a crystal clear, unredacted invoice. $155. On the left are the minutes we are allowed to see. On the right is an invoice for $18,000 paid by our dues. From those same minutes, it was paid to a company called Evergreen Prestige Landscaping for common area clearing. He let the image hang in the air for a moment. 1:30. Over the last 6 months, Evergreen Prestige has been paid over $50,000, according to state business records. The owner of this company is Martin Duvall, Karen Duvall's brother-in-law. The room erupted. Shouts of "what" and "no way" echoed off the walls. Karen was ashen-faced, her eyes darting between Dan and the crowd. This was never about a view, Dan said, his voice cutting through the noise. It was about using our money to pay her family to improve the land behind her own house, likely to increase its value for a future development. My shed was just in the way. It was a pretext for corruption. 55. Now came the moment of the secondary moral twist. Maria Flores, Karen's board ally, saw an opening and tried to deflect. "This is an outrage," she interrupted. Standing up, Mr. Holston speaks of selective enforcement. But isn't it true that his friend, Gary Henderson, has a shed that clearly violates setback rule, WOM 5.1.3? If we enforce one, we must enforce them all. All eyes turned to Gary, who shrank in his seat. The timer ticked down. 35. Dan didn't flinch. He looked directly at Maria. "That is an excellent point. And it brings me to my final one. The difference here is one of materiality and motive. Mr. Henderson's 40-year-old garden shed is a non-material, pre-existing variance with zero financial impact on this community. He doesn't benefit from it, and we are not harmed by it." He turned back to the audience, his voice ringing with conviction. 15. The enforcement of this non-existent view corridor, however, is a material violation of our trust, directly tied to a significant financial benefit for the board president's family. One is a technicality, the other is a betrayal. He looked directly at Karen. This board has a choice. They can govern for the community, or they can govern for themselves. I think we all know which choice was made here. Yo 3, 0, Yo 2, 0, Yo 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, Yo. The timer flashed 0. Dan stepped back from the microphone. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the room exploded. The uproar was immediate and overwhelming. Homeowners were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. Karen Duvall sat frozen, a statue of disbelief, as her meticulously controlled meeting disintegrated into chaos. The management company representative, Jessica, seeing the legal firestorm erupting before her, immediately stood up and addressed the crowd. "On behalf of the management company," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone, "I want to state for the record that we operate at the direction of the board. We were not aware of any potential conflicts of interest regarding vendor contracts. We will be recommending to our corporate office that we suspend our contract with Oak Haven, pending a full, independent investigation." She was distancing her company from Karen so fast, it was like watching a ship jettison its cargo. From the back of the room, Eleanor Vance's voice cut through the din. "I make a motion from the floor for a complete, third-party forensic audit of the association's financials for the past 2 years." "Seconded," yelled Tom, the man fined for the basketball hoop. Before Karen could even respond, another homeowner stood up. "I move for an immediate recall vote for the entire board of directors." The room roared its approval. The two other board members, Philip and Maria, looked at each other in panic. Their loyalty to Karen evaporated in an instant. Philip Graham stood, his face pale. I support the motion for an audit, and I tender my resignation from the board, effective immediately." Maria Flores quickly followed suit. Stripped of her allies and her authority in the space of 5 minutes, Karen Duvall was left completely alone at the head table. She slowly gathered her papers, her hands trembling, and, without a word, she walked out of the room. No one watched her go. All eyes were on the future, on the work of rebuilding their community. The recall election was held 2 weeks later. A new board was elected, comprised of homeowners like Tom and a retired accountant who immediately began working with the forensic auditor. Dan was asked to chair a new oversight committee, tasked with rewriting the ACC guidelines to ensure transparency and prevent the kind of subjective abuse of power that Karen had perfected. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of collective purpose. Neighbors who had been afraid to make eye contact were now stopping on the sidewalk to chat, organizing work parties to help residents fix the petty violations they had been cited for. Gary Henderson's shed was given an official, permanent variance, a small but symbolic victory for common sense. The entire fine ledger from Karen's tenure was wiped clean. The community was healing. The sterile, tense quiet was replaced by the sounds of children playing and neighbors talking over fences. The soul of Oak Haven, which had been smothered under the weight of arbitrary rules, was breathing again. Months later, life in Oak Haven had settled into a new, healthier rhythm. The new board operated with a transparency that was almost radical in its simplicity. Every contract was public. Every meeting was open for discussion. And the Architectural Control Committee was now focused on collaborative problem-solving instead of punitive enforcement. Dan's Oversight Committee had drafted a homeowner's Bill of Rights that was formally adopted into the bylaws, guaranteeing due process and protection from arbitrary board actions. One Saturday morning, Dan was cleaning out his grandfather's old desk, sorting through decades of paperwork. In the back of a deep drawer, tucked inside a brittle manila envelope, he found a small stack of old photographs. One of them, a faded black-and-white picture from the late 1970s, showed his grandfather standing proudly on a plot of undeveloped land. The familiar oak trees of the future Oak Haven in the background. Standing next to him, looking furious and defeated, was a younger man. Scrawled on the back of the photo in his grandmother's elegant script were the words Joseph winning the property line dispute against the Duvals. 1978. Dan stared at the photo, the pieces of a much older story clicking into place. He recognized the angry man in the picture from a portrait he'd once seen in a local newspaper obituary. It was Karen Duvall's father. The land her family had lost in that legal dispute decades ago was the very same land adjacent to the utility easement. The land she had been using HOA funds to improve. Her vendetta hadn't just been about power or money. It was older, deeper, and far more personal. Her obsession with the view, her fixation on his shed, her relentless campaign against his family, it was all rooted in a decades-old grudge. A deep-seated resentment against the Holston name and the property his grandfather had won from hers. He had been fighting a battle over HOA bylaws. But for Karen, it had been the continuation of a family war. She wasn't just trying to control a neighborhood. She was trying to reclaim a piece of her own bitter history. The knowledge settled in him, not with anger, but with a quiet, sad clarity. It had never been about the shed at all.